Alafia, I'm Dr. Gloria L, Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. The title of this show is Reflections on Black History, from Spirituality to Religion. That's a mouthful, and we probably can't cover all of that in the hour that we will be with you, but certainly we will try. I don't want to trivialize this program by introducing my guests in a way that might not appear to you to be paying the kind of tribute I intend, but I want you to know that I have the deepest respect for these two gentlemen on my show, and I refer to one of them as Bird and the other one as Train. And those of you who are jazz enthusiasts know that I'm talking about the most prolific of our and talented among our musicians, Charlie Yardbird Parker and John Coltrane. And I have with me, representing those people in terms of scholarship, that's the metaphor that I'm using, I have these two men who are at that level of skill in their scholarship to discuss this topic with me. I have Wane Sebamurti Gentry, Hotep.
Hotep.
And Professor Josef Ben Levi, Hotep.
Hotep.
Hotep. Now, we said reflections on Black history, and I just want to set a little context here, if I may. The first thing I want to do is to say that we have not been studying Black history as the usual thing that we do in the month of February. What we have been having is the study of Black biography. It has to do with the experience of certain selected Black personalities. Generally, they are African American, and generally their history begins around 1619, when the first captives are seen in the textbook coming off of slave ships. That is not Black history. That is Black biography, and it does not cover the vast history of people of African descent in America. So we're not talking about reflecting on a Black history that is that limited. The second thing is that we're not talking about events, persons, places, and things. What we want to concentrate on are ideas. We want to concentrate on the spiritual ideas of our people. We would like to have it known that our people did not wait to be discovered on their own continent and be given some ideas about spirituality, that we had our own ideas, because as the first people, we are the closest thing to the original creator that we can find in any way that we look for it. So we are here to discuss ideas and not talk about, you know, some event or some person. While we recognize that that is a part of Black history, I say that we have put too much emphasis on the biography aspect of history, and we have not looked at the part of history that talks about the ideas that African people used as a guide to their behavior on this planet. So having said that, we will try to now distinguish ourselves by beginning with the oldest spiritual ideas that we can conjure up, that we can identify as having been what our people, how our people saw themselves in terms of who they are and were from their beginning. So who wants to start?
Well, I guess I'll take a stab at it.
All right.
Thank you so much for
You're
inviting me
welcome.
to your show. And it's a very big and deep topic.
Yes.
A much needed conversation about something that is oftentimes left out in acknowledging and reflecting and studying Black history. And as you so rightly said, many people only go back to the times of the enslavement of African people here in America, in the programs and festivals and the many different things that times that are allocated for people to acknowledge our history. But being that we were the first people on the planet, then our history goes back all the way back to the beginning of humankind. And spirituality, as understood by ancient man, and I believe the most profoundest evidence of spirituality that is understudied now goes back to Nile Valley civilization. And the ideas are so profound, I don't even think that it's a proper word to even say that they're ideas, because what was discovered by ancient people in Nile Valley were revelations of a reality that transcends even ideas. And it's interesting because the ultimate reality that was discovered, which serves as the background understanding of spirituality as the source from which all other areas of spirituality come from, the name that was used to refer to that reality was Amen. And Amen itself is inconceivable, imperceivable. And so it's something that even transcends the mind and takes human consciousness back to the source. And this is spirituality that existed well over 15,000 years ago, when African people were really the only people on the planet that had culture and civilization and building civilization. So out of Amen pretty much came everything that is informing all of the spiritual wisdom teachings that you find all over the world, and whether it's in India and in Hinduism or Buddhism, all of these so-called spiritual teachings really represent a step down and a movement away from the authentic spiritual teachings that were birthed in Nile Valley civilization. So it's, what I would say as an opening is that it was from this realization of this reality that the name was used to refer to as Amen came forth all other types of spiritual teachings that inform human beings of the transformational stages of consciousness that we are supposed to go through to fulfill our life purpose and to know thyself, who we really are.
Before Ben Levi gets in here,
Okay.
I want to say that I appreciate, and I want our audience to appreciate, the difficulty that we have when we try to begin at, quote, a beginning.
Right.
Because there is a beginning that, as you pointed out, is imponderable. And when we speak of ideas, we're talking about representations of something about which we cannot speak because it's imponderable, because it's inconceivable, and therefore not an idea, but yet something, as you say, that was realized,
right,
that was the African wisdom that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Right.
That when you have all of the parts together, there is still something that is not there. You still don't have the whole. You have all of the parts. The sum of the parts is not equal to the whole, and that you can't even call it a part, but that is what is Amen. That is what is hidden. And that is that which we cannot know except to know that we know. You know, sort of like Sam Cooke say, I know, I know, I know, I know.
Right.
We know.
Intuitively.
Intuitively we know. But we cannot speak of it, we cannot describe it, we cannot conceptualize it, but we know that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that therefore there is this hidden, not even aspect will handle it. There is that which is hidden, which is called Amun, which is where African people start.
Exactly.
Right. Well, you know, since I'm with such a kindred spirit here, and I'm gonna compliment Brother Wanye in another area. One, you know, I mentioned to him before we came on the air that that he's a very, very knowledgeable brother, much more knowledgeable than he probably sometimes gives himself credit for, and he really is. But what I want to do is I want to point out a couple of things. One, you mentioned about Black History Month being.
No, I don't want to talk about month. I want to talk about Black history.
But I am. But this is leading up to where we're going to go. And the way that we've been conditioned to believe it is like the history of great men, which really comes out of a German model.
Okay.
By Harriman, who taught this idea of the history of great men. So we teach the history of great men instead of looking at the history of great societies. And so when we talk about the whole idea of traditional spirituality, and like Sebamurti properly talked about, Amen, there's something that's virtually inconceivable, because there are aspects of it when we look at Nile Valley civilizations, particularly ancient Kemetic civilization, or what they call ancient Egyptian civilization, and their notion of spirituality. They had what were known as the 8 infinite ones. And the 8 infinite ones was a beautiful concept, because you, unlike the analysis given in Hesiod and the Theogony, where you got the gods of silver, the gods of gold, the gods, but all these men coming along, and then when the woman finally does come along, Pandora, she's this person who brings trouble into the world. All right, their concept was that you had to have complements. You had to have a male and you had the female, and one of the things that started out with among the 8 infinite ones was noon and noonette, wateriness. You need wateriness because life grows out of the wateriness. And you had to have infinity, for example, because infiniteness is very important. We are finite. So you had all these different concepts along with hiddenness, unknownness, because Amen is unknown. It's beyond our conceptualization what this is, but we feel it. It's
unspeakable.
It's unspeakable, but we feel it. You know, I like to oftentimes tell my students when we get into this discussion that the wonderful passage in Isaiah 56, 8 and 9, where it says, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And I explained to them that this fundamentally means that the idea of creativity and the idea of the creator is not only unknown to us, it is unknowable. It is beyond our comprehension. And so within this, and then out of this, we have this family that later comes up. We have the earth, you know, Geb and Nut, the sky, and all these things that bring about life, that are very, very important to eschew moisture and Tefnut, that brings about the moisture and makes it happen. We have all these aspects that make life possible on earth. And then, of course, we have the idea of men. And man, all these things are complementary, because in the traditional African society, you couldn't have maleness without femaleness, and you couldn't have femaleness without maleness. You couldn't just have all males, and this is, and because it was like that, we can see the difference between the thinking in traditional European society when we look at, say, Plato's Symposium. In Plato's Symposium, the whole notion of beauty and love, what he called eros, right, from where we get the word, which we get the erotic, could only occur between an adult male and a young male suitor, that women weren't even really that important. And this was a very, very traditional view amongst them, whereas we see in traditional African society, you had to have a man and you had to have a woman in order to bring about the acts of creation. This was very, very important, whereas what we traditionally are thought to believe, and one of the things I always throw at my students, I always ask them, when did God become a man? The assumption that God was always a man. But maybe that wasn't there. You know, let's ask, when did this idea come about? What is the history of that idea? We just assume that because in the King James Version of the Bible, it said he this and he that. Well, in traditional societies, we realize that there were always males and females. Now, some people would argue that that is polytheism. And so for a minute, let me define the difference between monotheism, and polytheism, and another thing called henotheism. All right. Monotheism is generally traditionally assumed to be the belief in one God. Polytheism is assumed to be the belief in many gods. And that's only because most people are not looking at the Greek word mono, one, theos, you know, God, or poly, many, theos, God. But then there's henotheos, that is, that there's one conception of what God is, or what the supreme being is. This is a confusion that people have about those people who study about Akhenaten. Akhenaten was more a henotheist, that is, he was arguing that there is one concept of the way we should look at this power that makes life. And so the way that he presented that was with the sun disk that he called Aten. But if anybody ever studies the monuments, you see that the arms that are coming down as rays, at the end of them, they have the Ankh on them, the symbol of life. So these rays are bringing life down to the earth. And what he saw in that is the action of the sun on the earth. And that's something in science they call photosynthesis. But it was the action of the sun down to earth. But everybody understood that the sun ray had a foundation to make ray. And that was something that we don't know. We can't conceive of that. But the sun didn't just pop up by itself. The sun was created because there was a time when there was darkness.
The sun came forth.
The sun came forth.
Because we have a problem with this created thing.
Right.
You know, because if that which is hidden, from that which is hidden, things which are seen come forth, then you can't speak of them as having been created.
Right.
We don't have the language that we need. One of the reasons I think that we have a problem too is because with our tradition, with African tradition, the people were the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
The institutions were not buildings.
Right.
The church did not exist, not because Africans had no spirituality, but because the divine resides within. So the community was its own receptacle of the spirituality of the community. It was not somewhere external to them in a building.
Right.
In the same way that the education of the community was not something, some process that was conducted somewhere in some building. So that we have spirituality that came forth with the community that came forth, with the male and femaleness, with them came forth all of this, which then is expressed itself in succeeding generations, and now what we have is the family of man.
Yeah, this is why in ancient Kemet, in the language Medu Neter, they refer to things as netures. They call the language Medu Neter. That is, this is the divine speech, and everything has divineness in it. People are netures. The earth is a nature. The things that come forth from the earth all have nature in them. All of them have the quality of spirituality in them, so that they're all a part of this complete and universal whole. And hopefully before the program ends, I brought some examples of translations of text that I have done from the original. And it's really beautiful how the European Egyptologists have translated the text, and then if I give you the exact translation from the original, it has a very different meaning to it. And so, and I brought a couple of them because the idea of beingness, happening, something happened. They said when happening happened, everything happened. That's how they translate. And that happening, Kepler, right? That happening activity, and Kepler was symbolized by a beetle who was rolling up a dung ball, because the beetle laid the egg and rolled it up in the dung ball, and out of that something happened. And what happened was another life came forth, and so they saw that as an act of coming into being. That's how they translate it, as coming into being. This is often translated in English as creation, but no, it's coming into being, because there's a process of things constantly coming into being every day. That's a very, very common thing.
And what's interesting about this is because, as we mentioned, almond precedes everything that came into being. And almond being the nameless, genderless, formless, imperceivable, inconceivable, the nothing from which
The no thing.
From which everything came. And this everything, which Professor Ben Levi was speaking about, netters within everything, which translates in English so-called gods and goddesses, the netter and the netterus. That everything came from the no thing. So even prior to the netters was the almond. And ancient African people had this understanding that was deeper than anything that can be conceived. But it wasn't an understanding that was abstract, because we have been conditioned to think that if something is inconceivable, imperceivable, if it's formless and genderless, then, you know, how can we have any kind of connectedness to it, or how can we speak of it as being some reality that's, if it's antecedent to existence itself, then, you know, what are we talking about? But there was a realization that the intelligibility of what was being spoken of was speaking itself. It was from that this knowledge came. This knowledge of everything, all in the terms, the Shu and Tefnu and Nunanet, all of that, and all the symbolism and all the metaphors that were used to teach and help to guide humans into an understanding of this. All of this came into being in a highly impressive form in Nile Valley. Exactly. And it reached its classical era in ancient Egypt, and the remnants of it is still there. And all of the, like when Professor Ben Levi was talking about when did God become a man, you know, when did that happen? That's something that can very much be connected to the birth of many of the religions, because in all of the religions, that is what you will find. You will find a male deity being the creator God that is separate from creation, and there has to be some intervention between some divine force for salvation to be rendered upon people who are seeking to be free of the sufferings that makes up their lives. But that's not the way ancient African people understood spirituality. You can never be separate from who you are in this deepest sense, as if I can use the word spirit. You can never not be who you are, but you can be unaware of it. And being that who you really are as spirit is transcendental, it's beyond, as you mentioned before, when I talk about time, people, places, and events, because this transcends time. It transcends people, it transcends place, it transcends events. It's non-temporal, non-local, it's non-phenomenal. So that means that that reality is here right now. And we're simply unaware of it. There's something that we are doing that's causing us to miss being aware of it. And that's what we need to find out, what it is that we are doing in our way of attending to ourselves and our environment, our relationships, the world that we live in, what it is that we are doing that's causing us to miss this. Because a lot of the ancient civilizations, as you would see too, much of what they were studying was the order of the cosmos.
Absolutely.
And they patterned their sociological way of living, their community life, in concert with the order of the cosmos. And all of this also was connected to their own metaphysical anatomy, because the ancients also understood not just the physical anatomy, but there was a metaphysical anatomy, which was the ab and the sahu, the ku,
Sure.
the shekum.
Sure. Right.
And I mean, we've gotten away from that. We don't even know how to approach a real serious study of our metaphysical anatomy, from which deeper expressions of our human beingness is emanating.
Right, and that's a very good point. And once again, I'm gonna take the side of where the problem is, that where we got away from that, and that starts with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, in his writings, in his First and Second Discourse, Rousseau is really emphasized the idea, and we get the notion, cogito ergo sum in Latin. I think, therefore I am. Which separates us essentially, and Rousseau separated the mind from the body and created this kind of dichotomy, so that we don't see where we're all one. So in European thinking, that is separated, so we see ourselves as being separated from the reality that we're here and it's somewhere out there, instead of failing to realize that it's right here with us. But that's because we have been trained and the European Academy trains us, you know, to kind of be this way, and also it trains us to be, as we see in many cases, to be at odds with the other side of us, which is that feminine side, so that we have all these conflicts that exist between males and females, because within that worldview, the particularly European worldview, women didn't have any value. You know, and I emphasize, you know, when we look at this, we look at the early Greek writers, we look at Plato in the Symposium and Hesiod and Works and Days. You see where women had no real value, and maleness was very important. Patriarchism was very important. Nobody could see that closeness and that relationship. And so once we removed ourselves from ourselves, then we lost our way. And the consequences of losing our way was not being able to find the significance of hekau, right? That creative utterance, that force that makes things happen. But in some cases, there are people trying to get to that. For example, we've got brothers and sisters out here who are learning the Yoruba system in its various forms. Lukumi, for example, from the word Akumi, from the people of Aku, from Nigeria, from the Niger River area, or in Cuba they call it Santeria. And in Brazil, they call it candomblé, you know, or macumba, right? So, and all of these things involve some of those very fundamental ideas that actually stem from Nile Valley civilization. But Nile Valley civilization is always the foundation. This is why it is very important, and people like Sheikh Anta Diop and others who have worked on this have always argued that we must start in the Nile Valley, because you couldn't imagine in the history of the European Academy, particularly when you go back to the development of the German schools of thought, them starting any place else but with Greece. It's inconceivable to start European civilization without Greece and Rome, even though your earliest Greek philosophers were not even Greeks, and philosophy didn't even start in Greece. Right, which is very well known. They were Milesians. You know, Thales and Anaxagoras and Anaximenes and all these people, they were all from what we call Asia Minor. All right, because the reason why they couldn't have philosophy in Greece and why they couldn't think these ways is because they were in a state of perpetual warfare, which Thucydides talks about in the Peloponnesian Wars and some of these other things. And this is why people kind of overlook that, because you can only have that type of level of thinking and contemplation where you have peace. You can't think like that when you're trying to worry about somebody coming in, invading your home, taking your food, and taking your stuff from you. You can't think like that. You got to have a certain perception of peace and serenity in order to make that happen. And in early Greek society, didn't have it. Romans definitely didn't have it, because the Romans couldn't even think that far in terms of philosophy. They were warriors. And all they thought about was war. And even when they were able to overcome the Greeks and had them teach them, they wanted them to teach them about how to make better war machines. They weren't interested in all that beautiful stuff about what's happening with the soul and ethics. They didn't care about any of those things. They wanted to know, okay, you know, we got you guys. We're in charge now of Alexandria and all those books down there, and the Serapeum and all those books down there. What we want you to do is, we don't want you to learn how to make beautiful stuff and to make doors open up like as if by magic, or to make things move through the air as if by magic. What we want you to do is to go in there, look in those books, and show us how we can build some better war machines. Now, and just as a sidelight that I thought about, in Rome, they had an emperor who was their first African emperor, Septimius Severus. When Septimius Severus became the emperor of Rome, he changed the whole culture of their society. There was inflation when he came in. Taxes were out of hand. You had people bribing and stealing things. It's a lot like today.
Sounds like it.
A lot like today. But when he comes in, he brings prosperity. He changes the culture. He gets everything right. And all the people came up to be so happy. So I threw that out there as a kind of a sidelight, because, you know, history is a kind of funny kind of thing.
It repeats itself.
It does repeat itself, and we're seeing a very similar situation between Septimius Severus and our current president, Barack Obama, and maybe that'll happen. But also, one of the things that happened is that he brought Africa into Rome. He brought the Punic language and culture. In fact, it was known when he was on the throne that he wouldn't even eat food from Rome. He brought all his food came from Africa. You know, as I like to tell my students all the time, he liked his greens and his cornbread and his black-eyed peas, and that's what he wanted to eat. But he also brought in their belief system, which had its foundations in many, many ways in the Nile Valley. From ancient Carthage, and most people fail to realize, was actually a black civilization that controlled the known world for a long, 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 long time. And so we have all these traditions, and those traditions among the Carthaginians go back to the land that they call Palestine today, because it is spoken about in the Aeneid about how Elisar, or Dido, because he was very, very much in love with her, had to escape. Of course, she ended up killing herself, but her people escaped, went to Carthage, and established them a civilization. Now, that's the same civilization that early on was established among the ancient Canaanites, who had El, Baal, and Asherah, whom we get Elohim, whom in the Hebrew Old Testament is translated as God, or gods, as they sometimes say, all right, and who were the Canaanites, who were also the Phoenicians, who taught the Greeks the alphabet. So we have a whole line of history in terms of spirituality that is oftentimes overlooked because it's got different names on it and stuff like that. But these are some people who relied on the Nile Valley for virtually everything that they had going for them. So we always end up going back to the Nile Valley for the foundations of spirituality, even in its rudimentary forms that we find today, even as far as, you know, when we get to, and maybe we'll touch on that a little later on, early Christianity, which started in the Nile Valley.
But it was not known as Christianity. John Jackson has written Christianity Without Christ.
Yes.
And so the thing that I understand about the King James Version of the Bible, for example, is King James was a relative newcomer in this line of history that we started back with, the unknown, so that the story that he is having told, or at least plagiarizing and taking credit for being told, was not a story that could encompass the kinds of things that we're talking about here, because apparently the story starts, I think Ben Yakinen gave it a date. He gave creation a date.
Yes.
And do you remember that date?
Yeah, it was 4004 BC by it was done by the Archbishop of Canterbury. His name is James Ussher.
Okay.
And he picked a date like 4004 BC, and he gave the exact month, year, date, and time.
September, that's something to think of.
Yeah, okay.
9 o'clock
All
in
right.
September.
Well, it's about 9 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
Just, just pull something, they just pull it out the air. And of course, all these things have major, there are major problems with it that most people don't like to face. And when I teach my classes on this, I always try to point out to my students that we are trying to deal here with scholarship, not with beliefs. We're trying to deal with knowledge, episteme, knowledge, not pistis, faith. Because, even if we were to take the Greek model, they weren't real good on the faith tip. They were very much into the episteme. And Plato talks about that and I'm throwing these people out there because most people fail to realize that some of the foundations of the Western Academy and its thinking starts with those people. And these people actually took Kemetic material, and in some cases they modified it to fit their purposes.
But aren't we leaving out the fact that the Egyptians had the mystery schools, and that some of these so-called philosophers who are known in Greek culture as being the philosophical leadership, such as Plato, actually studied in the mystery schools?
Oh, absolutely. So
that whatever it was they had was imported, and I always think it was badly learned.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And you can see that when you compare the literature of the Nile Valley, when you study it, and then you see how they reworked it without kind of reworking it to make it fit a circumstance that was very contrary to the very people they were trying to send it to, the Greeks, because the Greeks didn't want to hear that. That's why, that was one of the problems they had with Plato.
Right.
I mean, with Socrates. Socrates was teaching foreign beliefs to the children. They didn't want to hear that. They couldn't even get into some of what he was talking about. And he was trying to teach them about ethics, teach them about value systems and stuff, which they didn't have. And when Plato, his student, comes along and tries to present these same ideas and starts talking about things like the transmigration of the soul, he really didn't understand the Peret Em Heru, or the book of the coming forth by day. He didn't really understand what they call the book of the dead. He really didn't understand those concepts at all. And if a person would take time to read their works, they would clearly see where all of these individuals give their acknowledgement to the Nile Valley. I mean, Plato does that in Timaeus and Critias, in the dialogue that goes along in there. There's Clement of Alexandria, H3O. They all give their homage to the Nile Valley. The only problem is that when our people are reading this, they're not making a connection between Egypt is in Africa. That Egypt is not in the Middle East. As my late brother Roosevelt Roberts used to say, the middle wasn't east or where, all right, because the whole concept of the Middle East didn't come into existence until the 1900s. Egypt is in Africa. You can't go to Africa and Egypt too. When you go to Africa and you go to Egypt, you're in Africa too. All right, so that is very, very important. And when they were there, at that time, that the Greeks and Romans are there, some of the greatest literature we have on ancient Kush is written during the time of the Greco-Roman period in Egypt. So when the Romans and the Greeks were looking at the ancient Egyptians, they were looking at the Kushites, or people that we would call otherwise, and black people look like us, walking the streets around here on the west side and the south side of Chicago. And so they were constantly being informed in these areas. And of course, out of this eventually grew what we have today as the earliest of the so-called Western religions, that being Christianity. And I'm not, for your audience, I'm not taking away Constantine and all that. That's a whole history by itself. But before they got on, there was a whole other program going on in Africa before any of the 27 books of the New Testament were ever written. There were already literature already written before then. It's just that we don't know anything about that literature because they tried to get rid of it until 1945 when it was found.
Well, you know, the thing that impresses me most about the distinction is that the location, you know, the location of those things spiritual outside of the human community, outside of it. The deities are outside. The only begotten Son, the only begotten Son. So that leaves all the rest of humanity outside of the family created, the created family. This whole notion, Africans saw everything as being within. Right. Everything as being the kingdom of God is within. They saw everything as being within. The education was within. The spirituality was within. All of it was within. To me, the greatest blow that we've suffered as a community is having the dislocation of the divine, to have the divine extricated, to have been eviscerated, to have the divine drawn forth out of you and cast away from you, and you spend the rest of your lifetime trying to appeal to something that is afar, something that is not only hidden and unknowable, but something with which you really have no relationship except by permission of this thing that has been, from which you have been removed or has been removed from you. I don't know which way you want to take that, but just the whole idea that when you hear these stories are not about you. It is not about the journey within you. Right. The Trinity is not about you. If you're a woman, you fall into that category in the Hesiod, Works and Days, where the name itself, when you break it into syllables, woman, woe, W-O-E, plus man. Woman was created to bring worry or woe to man. That is what she did after men were, you know, descending from each other and getting along just fine. All of a sudden, because Prometheus stole fire and gave it to man, then this thing was created, this woman was created as a punishment to penalize man for accepting hot goods.
That's right.
Man didn't steal the fire. One man stole the fire, but because the other man dared to accept it, this gift, now all men have to suffer these women who have been created simply to aggravate men and to make their lives miserable. Now, here you have myths that if you are a female, and I don't like that any better, but if you are a so-called woman, female, I'd rather be a sister or a mother or something that has a kinship term. But if you are one of these, then your only claim to fame is that you upset the apple cart, that you came in and Pandora, you opened up the box and let the worries out into the world. Or if you are a black person, your ancestor looked upon his father's nakedness and caused you to be cursed and made the drawers of wood and the hewers of wood and the drawers of water and the servants of mankind. So you have been effectively excluded or cut away from, excised from the human family and from anything spiritual. When you get to religion, you have no place in that religion except as the cursed one. And when you start thinking about people coming into the world naked, you know, how does it become a crime to see nakedness? Why would, you know, what is this benevolent God who so loved the world that he would curse a whole ancestry for seeing what the God created? It's so confusing, and people are asked to accept these notions as though there were no other things that they could relate to. There were no other realizations that they could know,
Right.
that they could just know.
And what's interesting about what you're saying, you're hitting home with a lot of things with me personally, because as a child, the main reason why I really couldn't get into all of that is because as I was reading it, it just didn't make sense to me. Just as you said, what's supposed to be so abominable about seeing nakedness? It just didn't make sense. Or a God saying, well, let me just turn and let you see my back parts. You can't see my front parts. None of that was just making any sense to me. And I guess intuitively knew that these teachings had to be tampered with by someone who just clearly didn't understand some teachings they had gotten a hold of. And I think it was deliberately so to keep us ignorant.
Yes, yes.
You spoke two things. You're right. The greatest tragedy of what is being done to the human family is arresting their development and stopping them from fulfilling the true purpose of human life by placing the divine that dwells within as well as without, solely without, saying that you must worship and lead a life where as best you can have a proper relationship with God, which exists outside of yourself. And through some medium, your salvation is to be won. And that is an arrested development that takes place for anyone who subscribed to that. And the purpose of life can never be fulfilled because in education is connected to spirituality, can never be divorced, because what is being reduced is the divine within. Your full humanity includes an awareness of the divine that dwells within, and you'll never be aware of it as long as you're looking without thinking that at best you can only have a relationship with the divine. And it's interesting that we're talking about the cutting away and splitting off of male, female, the feminine, masculine essence, because ancient African people in Nile Valley also was about ma'at.
Right. Most
balance.
Most important.
Most important.
Yes.
Was ma'at.
Yes.
Which the counterpart being Tahuti, but the most important was ma'at, balance. And even in the understanding of disease as it comes about, it's through an imbalance of energies. And if that is true, then an imbalance in your understanding of what is your reality, that itself constitutes a type of disease, a mental disease. We have like a spiritual amnesia.
Schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia, all of them roll up together, that is showing its effect in the way we're living and the way we're trying to live and establish relationship amongst ourselves. And we will never accomplish what we're here on the earth to accomplish as long as we're approaching all of this from these perspectives. And this is why it's so important whenever you're trying to understand anything that you must start off with the right perspective. And a lot of times as I try to facilitate a message, I always start with perspective, context, and focus. You don't focus on things out of context, otherwise you'll get the wrong meaning. And you don't try to establish a context with things without first starting from the right frame of reference, the right perspective. And even as we speak, a lot of times we might say, do you understand what I mean? We know the person has heard us, but we're wondering if they have received our words in the right context, otherwise they're not going to understand what we mean. And many of us are proceeding with the wrong perspective. as it relates to an understanding of ourselves, as it relates to understanding of spirituality. And we will never be able to focus rightly on what we should be focusing on because the whole context is all messed up. The context has really been messed up, the fact that most of the information that Professor Van Levi has shared some very valuable knowledge. Most of this information has been colonized and corrupted, whereby you'll never find your way back from having religious ideologies which are designed to keep you subordinate, to keep you in a position to be controlled and exploited, which is sadly the truth of what is happening. You'll never find your way back from religion to spirituality if you don't decolonize this information that has been forced on you as some form of simulated program that's running through you. You're never gonna find the truth. So you have to see the conditioning that's operating in your mind, see the falseness of that, remove all of this false information, remove all these false perceptions, and then by doing so, now you have an opportunity to really learn about yourself and learn about the spirit that dwells within in the same way that ancient people of Nile Valley understood, because what we're attempting to understand is beyond time and place and space. So it's not like me having consciousness now that I'm disconnected from that reality and that I cannot become aware of that reality. I can become aware of it.
That's then what you said, something you said was very, very true and important. I was thinking about the words of Dr. Wade Noble when he said that we don't suffer from mental illness, we suffer from mental disorders because we're out of order. Mm-hmm. And we need to find our way back into an order of things. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, until we come to recognize how information has been colonized, and we decolonize. And decolonization sometimes requires doing something very painful. Right. You know, it requires sometimes having to look at everything that you have learned, but to look at it differently. And to see that what you have been taught is something that is not that you shouldn't know it, because I think part of having a world view is knowing the world. But to understand what shoes you walk in and what shoes fit your feet. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes we walking in the wrong shoes and we wonder why things are not right, because we cloud hopping around in shoes that don't fit us. And until we find out what shoes should be on our feet and where we stand, we sometimes miss the boat, because we have been conditioned to believe that, and I'll give a classic example. We were conditioned to believe that the information that we are to acquire for ourselves, to know ourselves, we shouldn't acquire that. A good example is Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, 1954. While Thurgood Marshall argued that case, and everybody knows Thurgood Marshall argued the case, and he's one of those great men that they talk about in history, people don't know much about what Kenneth Clark, who was the psychologist in the case, was saying. He argued fundamentally that black children, if they went to school with other black children, could not learn. Now, the reverse was never asked. Well, is it true that when white children are going to school with other white children, are they being deficient in their possibility of learning? So the substance that we must put black children with white children in order for black children to get some type of learning, some type of schooling, some type of education. The reverse was never asked, well, maybe we should let white children get with black children and learn from them, and maybe they can get some schooling education. It was never thought of that, because there's a certain hierarchy in the assumption based on colonization of information. And the colonization of information suggests that knowledge flows only one way. And this is why, even to this day, our notion of spirituality, our notion of history, our notion of socialization, and everything starts with a bunch of people who were struggling for their very existence, i.e. the Greeks. And the Romans, who were constantly concerned about their existence because they were very, very concerned constantly about the barbarians, as they call them, coming in to invade them and taking over their stuff. So
we got 3 minutes, and I'm just, I just can't take this, because when you brought up Kenneth Clark, the only person that ever gave me a stroke while I was standing on my feet, because, you know, he did this doll experiment. And the thing was that nobody ever considered the fact that black children selected the white dolls because in their minds dolls were white. In the same way Santa Claus was white. In European culture, Santa Claus is white, dolls are white. So if you're choosing the authentic thing, black children did not want a black Santa Claus because they knew that's not the real authentic Santa Claus. It was not because black children didn't like themselves. It was because if you're telling them to choose a doll, they are identifying with, this is a doll, dolls are white, this is the best doll. Okay? So Kenneth Clark gives me all kinds of problems, but when you spoke about solely placing that which is divine outside of ourselves, that's crucial, that's critical. We must understand the balance. These two things we must lead with. There must be balance in all things.
Yes.
There as it is above, so it is below.
Exactly.
As it is out there, so it is in here. It cannot be otherwise. And anytime we are pursuing any kind of information, and information is not how we're going to rescue ourselves. We're going to rescue ourselves through meditation, through encountering that which is incorruptible. The voice that speaks to us that cannot be corrupted because it is heard in here and not spoken from out there. You don't have to trust somebody out here who has an axe to grind, a colony to manage, or whatever. So it's very important that we hold on to this notion of ma'at and balance, and this notion of not allowing ourselves to be seduced by ways of life that are solely external to ourselves. Because if they are not a part of us, then we don't need to be a part of them. Something is missing. We are not whole. Would you agree, gentlemen?
I agree 100% with you that our circle has been cracked.
Okay.
It's been fractured.
Okay.
And until we can bring that circle back together again, until we can realize that we are part of that one universal whole.
We have to say something about this, the conference coming up.
Okay.
The conference, hurry up.
Yeah.
You got 1 minute.
The ASCAC conference, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations conference, is going to be held March 26th through the 29th. It's going to be held at the Jacob H. Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies at 700 East Oakwood Boulevard. We ask that you all come out. Some of the great scholars will be there to present. You wouldn't want to miss it.
Hotep.